Okay, good afternoon everyone, and welcome back from a packed afternoon of stream sessions. And welcome once again to those of us joining us watching the live web stream. We turn now to the world of work. Yesterday we heard a bit from Linda Grattan about how work ought to change as a result of the prospect of the 100-year life. We're going to turn now to what in many ways is an even more fundamental question. As the nature of employment changes, how do we make sure that work is good for us? Because this concept of good work is at the heart of Matthew Taylor's work, both as Chief Executive of the RSA and in leading the recent independent review of modern working practices. So what's driving the need to reassess work? As we reassess it, how can we make sure that it has value for people who are doing the work? And critically for this audience, I think, what might rewriting the rules on employment, status, wages and our taxation system mean for us in the workplace pensions industry? Matthew, over to you to guide us towards some answers to those and other questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Graham. I wish I'd been here to listen to Linda. She's spoken at the RSA, and I think that stuff that about longevity is fascinating. I sometimes remind her of a wonderful statistical quirk a few years ago, which was that there was a year when the life expectancy of people who lived in Ascot, just outside, a very affluent place just outside London, went up by more than a year in a year, which meant that statistically speaking, the people of Ascot became immortal. Which is a slightly frightening prospect, I have to say. I won't be using slides. I'm afraid. I gave up using slides a long time ago. I used to run a think tank called IPPR, and we did a major piece of work and we launched it at a conference. It was live on Sky, I think, in front of journalists. I think the ministers were there. I'd asked an intern, bright intern, to do the PowerPoint presentation. They'd done it, they'd used the spell check, but they'd used it in a rather uncritical way, so when the slide went up, it was headed daft recommendations of the IPPR review on public-private partnerships. So I don't use PowerPoint anymore. So no, it's great to be here. I'm going to talk about my review. I got here a bit early, so I wandered around the exhibition stands. I was offered, as I walked around, I was offered a pint of beer, a pint of lager, 3 glasses of champagne, and a martini cocktail. So I just want to say to you that in the face of austerity and economic turmoil and falling living standards, you ought to be commended for how well you're holding things together. So what I'm going to talk about is the context for the review that I undertook. I'm going to talk about the approach that we adopted to it, and I'm going to talk about the principles that underpinned it. I would encourage you to read the report because it's not that long. I rewrote it several times to make it more readable. And I'm not really going to kind of go into all the detail of it. There are kind of 55 recommendations and actually lots of other things that we argued for which we didn't specifically recommend but which are pretty clear in the review. So I'll try and keep things at the kind of level of broad principles. So the starting point, I think, is to remind you of the context for the review. And the context is, on the one hand, that it's important to recognise that we do pretty well in this country in terms of creating jobs. We have the lowest unemployment rate for a generation, and we have pretty high participation rates. So if you look at America, for example, it may look as though their unemployment rate is as low as ours, but that's partly because there are a lot of people with children, a lot of older men who've simply dropped out entirely of the labour market. So we're good on employment, we're not bad on participation rates. Secondly, the flexibility that we have in our economy. There are lots and lots of different ways to work in the British economy that are allowed in the British economy. That's a good thing. So most people who work in non-standard ways, they're self-employed, they're gig workers, they're 0 hours workers. Most people, between about 2/3 and 3/4, generally speaking, in surveys, say that they are working in that way because they want to work in that way. And that flexibility will, I think, be a good thing into the future because as more of us reach pension age but don't have sufficient pensions, these ways of working a few hours here and a few hours there, maybe it's a bit of gig work or maybe it's selling stuff, being an Airbnb host, all these kind of activities that we can now undertake in our own way to top up our income. I think that's a really good thing, and it's also something which is suited often to young people and to their lifestyles and to their need to earn while they're learning. So flexibility is a good thing. And the final, in terms of context, because I do think it's important to say that whilst I was focusing on things that are going wrong and things that needed to be addressed, this takes place in the context of things that are going right as well. The third thing to say is that at the moment, and this is great, and I don't know how long it's going to last, but it's a good thing. At the moment, people on the lowest incomes in this country are getting the biggest increase in their incomes. Now, that is in the general context of falling living standards, but the combination of the rising living wage and the tightness of the labour market means actually it's the people at the bottom of the wage distribution whose incomes are rising fastest at the moment. So there are good things going on, and that means that whatever reforms I proposed, that I suggested, should not imperil those good things. What are the problems then? Well, I think two, really. The first is that we have an issue about the quality of work that takes place in the British economy. And as is the case with most things in our country, bad stuff goes together for people with the fewest choices. So people with the lowest paid, lowest skilled job also have the lowest quality job, the least level of security. They're least likely to have a voice at work, to have paths of progression at work. So the Prime Minister asked me to do this piece of work, partly in light of at the expose of a number of cases of people really working in ways and conditions, circumstances on a basis that seemed unfair and unreasonable. And the second bit of context is the emergence of new business models. So actually my review, as I'm going to describe to you, was much broader than this, but many journalists, bless them, thought that all I was interested in was Uber and Deliveroo. There has been a growth in gig work. It's still a pretty small part of our economy. The fact of the matter is most of us still work in a fairly conventional way. We have permanent jobs, we have full-time jobs. Anyone who tries to get on the Northern Line in the morning can testify. You know, we go to work in the morning and we come home at evening. That is still the predominant model. But bubbling under that, there are shifts, there are changes. New models emerging. And one of the important things for me to get across to you about the review is that very often people caricatured it as being an argument between, on the one hand, kind of workers and trade unions, and on the other hand, managers and bosses, firms. Actually, a lot of what's going on is to do with competing business models. It's to do with businesses who give their workers rights and who pay their employment taxes, fearing that they're going to be undercut by businesses who have found ways of not respecting the rights of their workers, classifying them as self-employed and not paying employment taxes. So if you look at the delivery sector, that's a particularly good example. Royal Mail employs its workers, it pays national insurance on them. It is being undercut all the time by companies who do similar kinds of things when it comes to delivery and distribution, but are saying that their drivers, their distributors, are not workers, don't get worker rights and entitlements, and are self-employed, so therefore they don't have to pay employers' national insurance on them. So the danger here is that if we don't address these issues, what will happen is that new business models will win out, not because they're more entrepreneurial or more creative or more innovative, but simply because they found ways of gaming the system. And that's an important issue for me to address. And I've met lots and lots of business people. Unfortunately, they don't talk about it as much as they need to publicly, who have said, you need to act, otherwise my model, which seeks to be responsible, is going to be fatally undercut. So that's the context for our work. The second thing I want to talk about is the kind of methodology that we used in our work. And if I had more time, I would explain to you that this is a methodology derived from 30 years of experience I've got in public policy making. In my view, most public policy fails. Sometimes it fails kind of heroically on a kind of poll tax, London Underground, public-private partnership, child support agency, universal credit kind of way. Other times it kind of fails in a more modest way. That is to say, it fails because the policy has an impact while we have our foot on the accelerator, while we're investing money in it, but the second our attention turns, things revert to how they were before. And my diagnosis, the RSA, the organisation around our diagnosis of why that happens is because policy suffers from two faults. On the one hand, it's too scattergun, and on the other hand, it's too path dependent. And so the approach that I have developed over all my years in public policy, years predominantly of failure, is that one needs to work, on the one hand, much more systemically. One has to understand problems as existing within systems and try to address the system as a whole to shift the equilibrium in a system. On the other hand, you need to work in a much more agile, experimental, adaptive, opportunistic kind of way. And that was the approach that I took to the review. So on the one hand, I thought about good work not simply in terms of labour market regulations, although I had recommendations about that, but I thought about all the factors that shaped the quality of work in our economy. And so we made recommendations about industrial strategy, saying that industrial strategy shouldn't just be about high-end, high-export, high-tech areas, but it ought to also be about large, low-skilled service industries. You know, it might not be as sexy for politicians to go and visit a care home as it is to visit a cutting-edge engineering factory, but actually if we're going to solve our productivity challenge, we need to be addressing those large, low-skilled service sectors as well. I talked about health and well-being and the role that I thought local authorities could play in working with employers and the health service and others to try to ensure that people can stay in work even when the health status changes, but also how can we make work better for people's health. I looked at expanding the role of the Low Pay Commission. Low Pay Commission at the moment, it sets the living wage. But what we're going to see over the next few years is certain sectors and certain places where we're going to have an unprecedentedly high number of people on the living wage. We're going to have certain sectors where more than 25% of people are going to be on the living wage, and localities. Now, we've never had that before, and the danger is that those people just get parked. So I said that the Low Pay Commission should work sector by sector on how it is that we can improve the quality of work and develop paths of progression in those kind of sectors like retail, like social care, security, hospitality. We looked at a whole variety of other areas. Employability was an area we looked at as well, and how is it we can strengthen the framework for those kind of soft skills that employers say matter so much and enable people to find it easier to transfer between jobs. So on the one hand, we looked across the system as a whole. On the other hand, when it came to what we advocated in terms of concrete measures in the here and now, generally speaking, we resisted kind of big levers. We resisted people who said, well, what you need to do is to completely scrap, you need to ban 0 hours work. Or you need to get rid of the fact that there's a kind of category called worker status, which stands between employee and self-employed. We didn't really think those kind of big sticks were the right way of going about things. Partly because we felt there may well be all sorts of kind of unexpected adverse consequences. Instead, we recommended an approach which I've described as more nudge than shove. We looked at ways, smaller interventions, more modest interventions, which we thought could shift the incentives and address some of the problems that we saw. So the kind of thing we argued for was that every worker and every employee should get on day one of their work a simple plain English statement of their terms and their conditions and their entitlements and how much pay they'll get. Now that might seem to you to be, a very footling little measure, just that's not much, just getting that on day one. The fact of the matter is, lots and lots of people don't do that, don't get that, and I'll give you a consequence of that. Many people who do casual work in this country, even though they're actually entitled to holiday pay, don't know they're entitled to holiday pay and don't claim that holiday pay. And actually the agencies that employ them go out of their way not to tell people they have that right. So giving people very basic information on day one, forcing employers, forcing firms to clarify people's employment status, forcing them to be very clear about any money that's going to be withheld from them by the agency, by the umbrella company or whatever. It's a small measure, but it could have a big difference. We also argued that people who have worked in 0 hours contracts or in temporary contracts should, after a certain period of time, have the right to request fixed hours, the right to request permanent jobs, and that companies should publish how many people have made those requests and how many they have acceded to. We also recommended that people receive a higher minimum wage for non-guaranteed hours. And that was partly just to put more money into the pocket of people on the minimum wage, on the living wage, but it was more importantly to say to employers, could you do more to give people guaranteed hours? You should pay a premium for not guaranteeing those hours, because people who don't have guaranteed hours, they find it hard to get loans, to get mortgages, to get all sorts of other things where you need to be able to prove that you've got a consistent source of income. And so the idea of a higher living wage for non-guaranteed hours was to nudge employers to think a little bit harder. Do they really have to do what too many of them are doing at the moment, which is transferring all their risk onto the shoulders of individuals? Could they do more? And some companies have already done more. So McDonald's, for example, they asked their workers 2 years ago, what do they want to change? Many of their workers said, we'd like fixed hours, and they have now enabled that. And so about 20% of McDonald's workers have said, yes, I want fixed hours, and they've now got fixed hour contracts. So it's perfectly possible to do, and we nudged people to do that. We also argued for a massive reduction in the threshold for people at work to get independent representation and rights to information and consultation. You know, it's a tiny step towards the industrial partnership model that people take for granted in continental Europe, but it's an important step. At the moment, the threshold is incredibly high, so very few people, very few workers have claimed that right to independent representation, rights to information, rights to consultation, but we think a step change in that should occur. And that's partly because as I went around the country and I spoke to people on 0 hours or low hours contracts, those workers who don't have right to claim unfair dismissal, one of the things they said to me again and again was, we feel if we ever complain, if we ever raise a concern, if we ever say a manager is bullying us, we will simply be denied the hours upon which we rely. And so it seems to me that to give those people somebody they can go to, they can express concerns to, has a right then to take those concerns to management. It won't just improve employee relations, it will improve the productivity of our firms as well. So that was our approach, to look at the system as a whole, but to have an approach which was more kind of nudge than shove. Now, one of the issues we looked at when we looked at the system as a whole was the question of tax, and in particular, we looked at the issue of self-employment. And there, of course, there is an issue of relevance to you and one that you'll be acutely aware of, and I'm sure you've been talking about, which is the issue of self-employed people in particular and pension saving. And I'm very happy to be open with you about the fact that I had an argument about that issue, which in the end I kind of acceded to the view that was expressed to me, and that's absolutely fine. So there is a chapter in my review about tax, and what we argue in that chapter is that basically we need to move towards a more consistent way of taxing labour. At the moment, all of us, we pay, when we consume labour, we pay less tax on self-employed labour than the tax we pay on employed labour. So if someone is a gardener in your garden, I'm assuming you've all got big gardens, if you have a gardener in your big garden, if they're self-employed, you will have to pay them slightly less because you don't have to pay employers' national insurance. If that gardener, the same gardener, was employed by a firm, then that firm would be paying their employer's national insurance contribution, and that, of course, would go into the costs that you would pay the firm. So we argued that we should have a more consistent way of approaching the taxing of labour, because that would reduce the incentives for bogus self-employment. Now, in a separate chapter, we argued that the government should look at the rights and entitlements of self-employed people, and in particular, it should think about how it can incentivise self-employed people to provide better for themselves in relation to health insurance, but particularly insuring themselves for ill health, but particularly in relation to pensions. Now, the argument I tried to win but lost was to connect those 2 points, to suggest that if you were raising more money by us paying slightly more tax on the labour of self-employed people, you could use some of that money to incentivise self-employed people to save for a pension. The Treasury was resistant to that for reasons that I'm sure you can understand. But I think politically it's still an argument that holds water. And I look forward with great interest to the government's consultation paper on how it is going to address the question of self-employed pension saving. I think auto-enrolment is a good idea. I mean, the Pension Policy Institute said it'll only help about 2 million of the 5 million self-employed people. It's only relevant for about 2 million, but that's still a lot of people that could be helped. But for me, the question is, if you're going to auto-enroll people, don't you need to give people some kind of incentive? And if you are, how are you going to pay for it? Which was why I suggested that link. I didn't win every battle in the review. I want to end by going back to the principles of good work, which underpinned the whole, everything that we did. So I argued very early on in the process of the review that we should, as a country, assert the ideal that every job in the British economy should be fair and decent, with scope for fulfillment and development. And at the time, I thought that was quite a kind of radical thing to say, because there is a kind of quite deep view that there just will always be loads of rubbish jobs, you know? But actually, as I've gone around and as I've spoken to people, there has been a recognition that that idea that every job should be fair and decent and that people should have scope for fulfillment at work and scope for development at work seems to be one that strikes a chord. And we argued in the review that good work matters for a number of reasons, and I'll just spin quickly through those before I finish and have a chat with Graham. So, the first reason we said that good work matters is this. I'm old enough to remember the kind of deal which I kind of grew up into a world where there was a kind of social contract, and that social contract said to people, if you work, if you have a full-time job, it was mainly with men, it has to be said, but if you work, if you have a full-time job, your living standards will rise and you'll be economically secure. Now, we can no longer make that promise. That contract is bust. You know, there will be, despite the good news that people on the lowest wages, their income is rising fastest at the moment, for the foreseeable future, there'll be lots of people who work hard and still find it very difficult to make ends meet. And it seems to me the social contract should be that the very least we say to those people is that their work is decent and that they have realistic paths to progress at work. The second reason good work matters I've already referred to, and that's health and well-being. Bad work, stressful work, insecure work, work where you have no autonomy, where you're not listened to, is bad for your health. And that's not just bad for the individuals who are affected, but those people who drop out of work because their work is bad end up adding to the queues at GP surgeries, they end up on benefits. So good work has a wider externality in terms of health and well-being. Thirdly, and I've referred to this already, we do have a massive productivity problem in this country. We thought last year the statistics showed an uptick. People thought, oh, maybe we're coming out of this productivity problem, but we're not. The latest statistics are even worse. Now, nobody fully understands that productivity puzzle, but certainly most people would recognise that part of it is to do with management. And this isn't just me. Business leaders like Charlie Mayfield at John Lewis recognise this. If we could persuade people to bring their whole selves to work, we would have more productive, more innovative, better organisations and firms in this country. So good work and thinking about how to make work good is part of how it is we solve that productivity problem, that challenge. And then the fourth reason is technology. Technology is going to change things. I think all this stuff about 30% of jobs going, or the fact that in 15 years' time none of us will be here, will all be replaced by an algorithm is, I think the technical term, bollocks. But nevertheless, despite the fact that we don't know what's going to happen, and despite the fact that when you look at industries that really have been transformed, whether it's the music industry or retail, then actually music industry, everyone thought it was going to be dead, and now it's thriving. It's just got very different business models. Retail, yes, fewer people work in shops, but actually more people work in warehousing and distribution. So we really don't know what's going to happen, but we do know that the tasks are going to change. The makeup of work is going to change. And I think it's vital that as we think about technology and the impact of technology, the starting point is how can technology make people's jobs better, particularly the jobs of people at the bottom end of the labour market. It's absolutely crucial that we start from that. If we start from the view that says technology is an unstoppable force, get out of the way, it's up to us to serve the robots, then we will have the same backlash as we've had against globalisation. And the final reason I said good work mattered is that it seems to me there's a disjunction. When we talk about civil society, we say we want citizens who are engaged, who have voice, who are listened to, who, to coin a phrase, take back control. But we have this strange idea that that kind of model of citizenship stops. It stops at the door of the factory. It stops at the door of the company. It stops at the door of the shop, and it shouldn't. If we want that kind of citizen in civil society, we should want that kind of citizen at work. So those are all the reasons why I think good work matters. Now, I've got 1 minute and 10 seconds left. 3 quick things. The conversation, the debate that the review started goes on. Things have changed even since the review. The Supreme Court ruling abolishing employment tribunal fees, a very good ruling. I was delighted by it. That shifts things. It shifts certain arguments in important ways. Continuous court judgments, which are tending to fine for the trade unions against companies like Uber, that shifts things as well. So this is a continuing and rolling debate. It's a very complex set of issues. I'm still actually hearing ideas, which had I heard them at the time of the review, it's slightly frustrating, I would have put in the review. So I'm passing them on to officials. and saying these are other interesting ideas for nudging our system. This morning I spoke after Margot James, who's a minister in Bays, and she said some very positive things about implementing the review, so my fingers are crossed and I'm working across the political parties to try to get them to take this forward. But the final thing I would say in my remaining 13 seconds is what is heartening to me is that this idea of good work, whatever the government does, and I do hope they're brave and I do hope they're ambitious, this idea of good work seems to be striking a chord. Wherever I go, I'm hearing people say, yes, we're talking about good work. I'm hearing about research projects about good work. I'm hearing trade associations saying, we're talking about how our sector can improve the quality of work. It feels to me at a time of division and a time of pessimism, this idea that every job should be a fair and decent job with scope for development and fulfillment is the kind of idea that we need to seize onto in these kind of rather difficult times. So if you are interested in good work, read the review, encourage your MP to be brave and implement as many of my recommendations as possible, but also visit the RSA website. We're doing loads of stuff about good work. And I would say there isn't a person in this room who couldn't in one way or another contribute to making our economy the good work economy that we need. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you very much indeed. Just a reminder to those in the audience, you can submit questions via the app or otherwise get your questions ready because I'll be coming around to you in a moment or two. But I wanted to start first, Matthew, if I could, with a question about process, because you took the time to talk about your process. And I wondered when I heard you describe nudge, not shove, 55 different recommendations, quite a diverse package of things there, how you think we might measure success going forward?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So the temptation is to judge success by whether or not the specific recommendations are carried out. And of course I want as many of them to be carried out as possible. But actually, it is this good work thing that matters more to me. So, you know, in 5 years' time, looking back, and people say, was it a success? Only part of that will be that a reasonable number of those recommendations were taken forward. The much bigger issue for me will be, is there a sense that this kind of idea that we should want all work to be good work is one that has kind of taken root, that firms, that trade associations, that the business community, that trade unions and others continue to talk about how we can improve the quality of work. That would be the most important outcome.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I've got a question coming in from the app here. One of our speakers earlier today, Chief Executive of our sister organisation in Australia, suggested, I think, that automation is likely to make the quality of work worse. Do you think that's inevitable, or do you think there's something that can be done about that?
No, I don't think it's inevitable at all. And I think we're in a kind of peculiar position at the moment, which is that there's a lot of hype about AI and robotics. Actually, the RSA published a big report a couple of weeks ago called The Age of Automation. It's on our website, it's very good. What we found was that the big problem is actually the lack of take-up. You know, most SMEs don't have a plan to use this technology, they don't really necessarily understand it, they don't see its relevance. The danger, I think, is that not that we take it up and that it destroys people's jobs, that we don't take it up enough. The record shows that whenever there's a burst of technological innovation, there are always pundits to be found saying this is the end of work. And they are always wrong. I could create 2 million jobs in the British economy tomorrow. They'd be nurses, they'd be nursing assistants, teaching assistants, park keepers, youth workers, counsellors. You know, there's a whole lot of things that need to be done. So this is an issue much more of economics than it is of technology. And I just want to reiterate a point that I kind of referred to earlier, and I kind of swallowed because I don't know enough time. But look, 20 years ago, what did people say about globalization? They said, number one, it's an unstoppable force, financial globalization. Unstoppable force, get out of the way. Number two, it will adversely affect some people, but they just need to put up with it because in the end it'll be better for everybody. Three, it will destroy certain things that you care about. You know, your capacity to generate kind of taxes in one country, social justice, but just put up with it. And fourthly, you might not understand financial globalization, but it's fine because there's some very clever people in there what they're doing, right? So then we had 2008, and now we've got Brexit, and now we've got Trump, and now we've got other things. And that's a response to that kind of reductive account of globalization, which is an unstoppable force, get out of the way. The problem for me is that when people talk about technology, it's the same bloody tune. You know, this is an unstoppable force, get out of the way. You know, there will be losers, but they just got to put up with it. You will lose things that you care about, like privacy or being able to protect your children. And it's all very complicated, but don't worry, there's these guys in California who wear jeans and love their children, so it'll all be fine. And, you know, for me, we have to learn the lesson, which is that when we talk about change, we have to talk about in humanistic terms. We have to say, this technology has got to improve people's lives and improve the quality of people's jobs. And this kind of deterministic account that says this technology will have this result and it's going to lead to, you know, jobs disappearing and jobs being worse, I think we should reject it. It's up to us what this technology does to people's jobs.
And that concept there, Matthew, of sort of telling people of what the future might look like relates to something Linda said to us yesterday. She was talking about how as a society we need to narrate the future, I think was her term. And I wonder if you think there's more that can be done to paint a slightly less deterministic picture of our future.
So I think you have to work, when you're working on policy and change, you have to work on two levels at once. You have to work on the small, step-by-step, incremental things that you have to address here today. So there are a set of issues which you as a sector will be thinking about in relation to, for example, self-employment or other changes in the framework of pensions or how Brexit might impact you. And, you know, there's important work to be done to get those things right and to continue to reform and change the system so it keeps up. But at the same time, we have to imagine how the world may be very different in 20 years' time and have that in mind as we think about those day-to-day reforms. And so, you know, I think in 20 years, the idea I grew up with, which is you do your education at the beginning of your life, you work for 35 years, you retire, play golf and die. I mean, that's just men, I guess, but mainly. That will have gone. People will expect their education to take place throughout their lives. They will expect multiple different careers and work patterns. They'll expect to sometimes work for themselves, sometimes work for other people, sometimes drop out for work and go travelling or training. They won't have an idea of kind of retirement at a particular age, that it'll just be that your work patterns will change. They may not even have an idea of what a pension is, because it will be part of a kind of more general, more fluid approach to assets. So I think what we need to do is to simultaneously work on the things that need to happen today to make this system work, but also think deeply about a much better system, actually. A much better, you know, I mean, I think people in 20 years will look back and say, well, what do you mean you did all your education? It was all finished by the time you were 24. That's a bizarre idea, you know. What do you mean you kind of got to 60 or 65 and people said that's the end of your productive life? That's a ludicrous idea. So, you know, ultimately that's a liberation for human beings, and we need to have that in mind as well as addressing the issues we've got to face today.
Thank you. I think I've got a question up there. Number 4 has been waiting patiently.
We're waiting for some questions.
Sorry?
We're waiting for questions.
Yeah, I've silenced everybody. They've had too many questions.
Sorry, did you have a question?
No, we're waiting for you to offer them questions.
Oh, we've got one here then, number 1.
Great.
Hello. Hi, it's Francis Goss from AHC, also Director Trustee of Engage for Success. Thank you very much for your presentation, Matthew. You mentioned that you hope that government makes some brave decisions. Could you give some examples of the kind of brave decisions that you're hoping government will make, especially with regards to lifetime savings?
It's the last bit that's foxed me. I was all right until you said that last bit. So I'm not going to even answer it. If I had to choose the one recommendation that more than any other I hope the government acts on, it is this reduction from 10% to 2% of the number of workers or employees who have to say, I want independent representation, information and consultation. I think that would have a massive effect on improving employee relations and productivity, and start to make the idea of industrial partnership respectable in Britain. It is a kind of bizarre thing, and it's not, by the way, it's not just to do with employers. The trade union movement in this country has always been profoundly ambivalent about industrial partnership as well. So that would be the one thing. I was delighted this morning that Margot James, the Minister, said that the government it takes seriously my point about what I called one-way flexibility, and it takes seriously the need to address one-way flexibility, that transfer where companies transfer all the risk onto the shoulders of the most vulnerable individuals, and it wants to do something about that. So I hope that happens. I'm less optimistic when it comes to big issues like tax and pensions, because they're slightly beyond the core of my brief. And also because, look, the Chancellor got knocked back when he did an entirely sensible set of things in spring around addressing problems around self-employed taxation. So I think, there's a whole number of us, and I'm involved in this, need to engage the public in understanding why it is our tax system doesn't work, and at the same time, as I said in my speech, I think try to win an argument that says, you know, there's a win-win here. We could have a fairer tax system which doesn't drive behaviours that we don't want, and we might be able to use some of that to support self-employed people in particular in saving for later in life. And of course it's important not just for self-employed people, because if self-employed people don't save, then they are going to end up falling back on the state.
I'm going to steal our last minute, if I may, Matthew, to take one more question from the app, which is on a subject that's very close to our hearts, actually. And it's what should pension funds, as owners of companies, do to promote good work?
Oh, that's a great question. And actually, this is, I said that the conversation continued and I'd heard new ideas. And actually, my view on one particular thing has slightly changed. So in the review, in keeping with this kind of nudge rather than shove approach, what we argued was that companies beyond a certain threshold should be transparent about what happens in the labour supply chain. And this is really important, and I want to give you an example of this. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Manchester. It was raining. And I did an interview for the BBC about a road haulage company that existed in this part of the world. And it was run by a couple of cowboys who went off with the money. Now, the problem for those drivers was that those people who ran that firm had told all their drivers to set themselves up as sole traders. So when the company went bust, not only did they lose their jobs, but a few weeks later, they got a letter from HMRC saying, "You've wrongly described yourself as a sole trader, you owe us thousands of pounds in tax." So a terrible double whammy. Now, the question for me is, whose parcels are being delivered in those lorries? So I argued for transparency, but David Medcalf, who's the government's head of enforcement, I think he's going to argue in a strategy he's going to publish in the next few weeks that we should have, as they do in Netherlands, end user liability. So the ultimate user of that, which tends to be a kind of high profile company that cares about its brand, should be jointly liable for failures of enforcement which take place within the labour supply chain. Now, I didn't put that in my view, and maybe I was a bit of, maybe that was a lack of courage from me, but David, I think, thinks that is the right thing to do. And actually, interestingly, I have spoken to many firms who think that probably is the right thing to do. It'd be a challenge for them. So I think that when pension funds are investing in companies, one thing you might encourage those companies to do is to take responsibility for everything that happens in their labour supply chain. Because if they don't, not only will people be hurt, but in the end it will affect their own reputation.
That's an interesting build on our work on workforce reporting there. I could carry on for much longer, Matthew, but I'm afraid we are out of time for this session. That's been a fascinating insight into your work and into the concept of good work, which I know that people in the audience and certainly us at the association are very much engaged in for the future. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.